Okay, this is a video response to an ongoing conversation or discussion on the Talk Tennis forum. The original poster is having trouble with his base clamps. He's bought replacement base clamps for his machine and he's having trouble getting them to lock securely to the turntable. And I'm surprised, I'm going to tell you what I think is going on, and I'm surprised that a number of people have replied. And what I think might be going on, hopefully I'm right, because it'll be a very quick, easy solution. He won't have to go milling anything down. He's already talking about removing some material from the metal block. Mine's a brass block, the metal block that goes on the underside of the base clamp. So thus far, nobody has mentioned that. It sounds like what he has said is that he has tightened these bolts as tight as he can, and then when he's locking the lever, it's still sliding a little to some degree on the turntable. So despite the clamp being locked in the lock position, it's still moving, which is not desirable. And nobody's mentioned this. There's an adjustment screw here. Now mine's an exposed screw, but many clamps, and I think probably the clamps that he has, there's a little plastic cap there that you need to remove, and then you should be able to insert some type of a hex wrench in there and adjust that. And so my thinking is that right now, despite the fact that he is tightening these two bolts as much as possible, let me zoom in here a little bit. So you've got two bolts that hold this metal block to the base clamp. Again, this is a brass block, and it's kind of a, if you look at it from the end, it's sort of got a T shape, where there's a slot here, here, and here. And there's only two bolts that hold that down. So if he's tightened these as much as he can, and this still isn't locking, because just so that we're all on the same page, for those of you who aren't familiar with how these types of base clamps work, is I'm going to pull this away from the bottom of the base clamp so that you can see, hopefully, in there. There's a little gap, and when you push the lever, that gap, look over here, gets narrower. It may be hard to see on the camera. I don't know if you can. So I'm pulling out on this because obviously it's oriented this way and gravity is pulling this down. But I'm going to pull out on it, and if you take a peek, turn it over here, maybe there's more light. So look right there in the gap, and what happens is when you push the lever to the lock position, it sucks this block up closer to the bottom of the base clamp, like that. So I don't know if you can tell, but that gap there is going from a wider gap to a narrower gap. And that's all that tiny little bit of movement is all it needs to firmly hold this to the turntable. But if you've got this tightened as much as possible, you need to tighten this screw clockwise, because it will tighten, it will draw this piece here. So here's the brass block, and if you look, the brass block is screwed via these two bolts into a metal piece here. I'm going to take this apart in a minute so that you can see. But basically, if I turn this screw counterclockwise, this gap's going to get bigger without even touching either of these two bolts. And if I turn this clockwise, this gap here is going to get smaller. So I think he just has this screw out of adjustment. So hopefully, first thing I would try is put everything together and turn this screw clockwise, and then turn this, and this is a very sensitive adjustment, so turn this maybe a quarter of a turn, and then try locking it and see if there's any play on the side to side on the turntable. Unlock it. Every time you adjust this, you want it unlocked. So then maybe turn it clockwise another quarter of a turn, try locking it, see if there's still play, and just keep going. Maybe in increments of quarter of a turn or half a turn, whatever. And I think eventually you'll find a spot to where if you turn this far enough, this will lock and you won't have any play. So that's what I'm hopeful of. Now obviously mine is adjusted, so all I did to take this off of my turntable is I did not need to loosen this or tighten this at all. It's pretty much perfectly adjusted right now for how much pressure I want when I push my locking lever. I do loosen these screws, and let me take this apart so you can see what everything looks like. So you just remove these two hex screws, and I'll tell you sort of a little more detail about how to go about installing these or adjusting these. So very simple. Two bolts come out. This is the brass block. Like I said, it's sort of T-shaped, two holes for there. And basically, it's this surface here and this surface here that ride this portion of the brass block actually goes up between. This machine doesn't have rails, it just has slots in the turntable, but this part actually goes up. So if my fingers were the slots, this part resides between, whereas this portion here on each side sits just underneath the turntable. But this silver piece here is what I want to show you here, and it's maybe if I put a screw in it without the brass block, and then I can pull out on it. So if you can see how much this comes out without the brass block there at all, and then of course when I push the lever, it's drawn further into the bottom of the base clamp, and when I unlock it, it comes out a little bit. But if I start adjusting this screw, and I'll go ahead and do that, you'll see that this piece will come out more or less based upon how far you turn that. So let's just go crazy here. Like I said, this is a very sensitive screw adjustment, but let's say I go crazy. I'm going to, let's do it this way. You can see that this silver piece that the screws actually fit into, if I pull out on it, it does come out protruding from the bottom of the base, probably, I don't know, a little more than 1/8 of an inch. And if mine was doing what yours is doing, and this was too much space, too much gap, I basically want that to not come down as far. So if I turn this adjustment screw clockwise, let's go all the way around 1 full turn, maybe 2 full turns, if I can even go that far, barely. So I just turned this adjustment screw 2 full revolutions clockwise, and now this silver piece is barely protruding outside of the black body of the base clamp. And so now it's going to be tighter. What I suggest you do is actually take this screw and turn it counterclockwise a lot. You need to really loosen this. So that's back to where I started. So back that screw out counterclockwise 3-4 turns, 3 or 4 full revolutions, so that you know that it's going to be too loose. Then reinstall this onto your turntable, because what you want to ensure is that these 2 screws are as tight as possible. In other words, you want to have extra play so that when you put this back together, and once this is installed on your turntable, to absolutely ensure that there is, let me put these in a little further, because what you might be doing is you might be installing this on your turntable and tightening these screws, and there could still be a little gap between this metal block that you have and the piece that it screws into. So when I install this on my machine, what I do is intentionally have this loose so that these 2 screws get absolutely buried. They can't go any tighter. And in fact, I can tighten them before I ever even install it. And so I can now drop this down into the turntable and there should be plenty of extra play here because this is backed off. You install this, and then once this is now inside of your turntable, you know that there's no more clockwise adjustment that you can do on these two. So these two have been tightened to their maximum. Then you take up any additional play by tightening this slowly clockwise. And eventually this block should draw up against the bottom of this base clamp enough that eventually when you go to the lock position it should hold. Now I know that he was talking about his turntable being 7 millimeters maybe, and first I want to address the photograph. So there was a picture that was put up of someone holding probably a stock photo, and the first picture showed clamps like this, and they had a little red line drawn across the top of where the post goes in, and I'm using this little orange bread tie to represent the same red line. So in that photograph there was a red line going across this hole at the top, and it said 12.2 millimeter, I believe. So that was clearly showing you that that red line was representing the measurement across this hole. And then in the same photo they were showing the underside like this, and then there was a red line basically right here, and it was oriented this way. And so I know that he was initially talking about, he thought that this measurement, which by the way it says 9 millimeter in that photograph, but I think that what they might be saying is that because the red line is this way and not up and down, I don't necessarily think they're saying it's 9 millimeters of depth. In other words, from the bottom of the base clamp to the inside of the metal block. That might not be what they're saying is 9 millimeters. Because of the orientation of that red line being here, I think what they're trying to suggest is that the 9 millimeters may be the width of the inside from here over to here. In other words, not the width of the wide part of the block, but the inside, the narrow part of the T, if you will. And just for information, this is coming off of a Gamma machine. It's a Gamma turntable. So I pulled this out and measured mine, and if this helps at all, either the original poster or someone in the future, this measurement across the narrow portion of the brass block, in other words, the portion that would need to slide back and forth literally in between the slot and the turntable, is about 13.5 millimeters. It's actually 13.25, give or take. 13.29. So a little over 13 millimeters. So at least on mine, which is obviously a different model, this measurement going across here is not 9 millimeters. It's a little over 13 millimeters. The distance between, if I press the metal block up against the bottom of the base clamp, the measurement from I have to use something else as a depth gauge and then measure that. So that is about, let's use this bread tie. So if that's pulled in the lock position, that's going to be about there where my thumbnail is, and then if we measure that little tiny bit, that's going to be about about 9 millimeters. So maybe so that may be correct, even though they've got the red line drawn this way, which to me, at least to me, insinuated that they were trying to tell you what the width of this piece was going to be. Maybe they are actually talking about the distance of the depth, or in other words, the thickness of the turntable. But see if tightening this screw doesn't resolve the problem. Hopefully that's a quick fix. And if you don't, I think that you're right in that milling down If your turntable, now I measured my turntable too, by the way. Let's get all this out of the way. So I did measure the thickness of this turntable right here where I removed the base clamp, and this one is 9 millimeters, I believe. So if we start at 0 and measure inside of here, that's 9.7. I think earlier it was right at 9 millimeters. But obviously this is a gamma turntable, that's 9.5. So if your turntable thickness here, where your rails are, or your slots, if yours is like this, if it is indeed 7 millimeters, you may in fact need to remove a couple millimeters like you were talking about. So obviously you would want to take the 2 millimeters off of So if you end up needing to remove material, I think you're going to need to take 2 millimeters off of this surface that actually goes up against the bottom of the base clamp. So if you make this block thinner, and obviously whoever's removing that material, you'll need to be careful because although this block is relatively thick, you'll notice that there's a big recess for the heads of these screws. In other words, the only portion, there's a big recess that holds these screws, so there's a pretty deep pocket or recess right here. So that means that the only portion that, actually never mind, I'm sorry. I was thinking that this had threads in it. There was only going to be a very shallow portion that had the threads, but that doesn't make any sense, sorry. The threads are obviously over here, and that's what matters. So my concern was that if you milled this down, you might mill away the part that the screw needs to engage, so my bad. Anyway, so as you remove a couple millimeters of material from the upper side of the block, obviously this will get thinner. The screw can go through and it should fit shallower. So, but I would make sure that you know, take just this piece, just this block, and make sure that it actually fits inside of your slots or inside of your rails, and that before you go removing 2 millimeters of material from your block, make sure that everything else fits, you know, as it should. Don't put the cart before the horse. But hopefully I'm right in that everybody has missed the forest for the trees and forgot about this needing. So I'm hoping that your adjustment screw here is already counterclockwise too much, and that by turning it clockwise you'll draw this closer in and maybe you'll start to get some purchase on the turntable. So hopefully that helps out. Oh, so one more thing. Since I have to reinstall this anyway, I'll show you what I was talking about. So what I did is I just turned my adjustment screw 2 full revolutions counterclockwise, which I know will make it way too loose. I'm even going to turn it a 3rd time. So this is way out of adjustment. I want to do that intentionally so that now when I replace the brass block back into the bottom of the clamp, as I already stated, I want these screws absolutely all the way in. So I'll show you how this drops in. So these can already be tight. So I won't need to do any further adjustments from underneath the turntable because I've already got this really tight. Now you just have to have that lined up with the track when you put it in. Like so. And of course you replace this block, or at least on mine. Anyway, so we'll take care of that later, and there's screws that hold that in. But once this is in the track, because I have intentionally, sorry, didn't realize I'm out of camera. So once this has been dropped down into the track, because I had this screw mega loose to begin with, intentionally, it's because I wanted to illustrate that if I lock my clamp, move the lever to the lock position, it's still loose. Even though the two screws that are on the underside are as tight as they possibly can be. So now I unlock this and start turning this screw clockwise. So if I turn this one full revolution clockwise, it's going to get tighter, but I already know it's not going to be tight enough because I backed it off by 3 turns. But I'm just illustrating this is what I think might be going on, and I'm hoping is what's going on with yours. So now I try to lock it, it's still too loose. Doesn't seem to be working. Oh, before I go any further, we're going to continue tightening this. This is important. One of the other posters was calling attention to your mechanism, because yours is an auto release or gravity release clamp. You're not going to be able to lock it while the clamp is all the way down in the tube. Like that. It's not going to lock because the clamp is in the down position. The person who was trying to explain it, he said that this will only lock when this clamp is engaged up on the string, and that's not 100% what he's trying to convey. It's not that this clamp has to be on a string, it's that this clamp has to be raised up out of the tube so it's not residing at the bottom. So you can have the clamp all the way out and you should be able to lock the base because it doesn't think that the clamp, it doesn't feel the post hitting the mechanism down here. So you sort of got misunderstood at that you had to have the clamp inside and clamped onto a string, and that's not the case. So you can either raise this up every time you try to lock it, or it's just better while you're trying to do all these adjustments, just take this clamp all the way out. I meant to call attention to that sooner because that is very important. Is as you're trying to lock this and make these adjustments, if you've got the clamp sitting down in the tube, it's going to prevent the lock mechanism from engaging. So again, that's the locked position. It's still way too loose. So I'm going to turn this another full revolution. That's a half turn. That's another half turn. Hopefully you can see that pretty well. And let's try it now. So I lock it, still too loose. Remember, I told you I backed this off 3 times. So now I'll do a half turn. So now I'm roughly half a turn from where it had been to begin with. So we start feeling a little friction. Let's see here. So that's still going over way too easy. And I can feel friction now. If I push on it a little bit like this, it's not moving. But under the pressure of there's some sideways torque on this, I can move it sideways, or if I push hard enough, I can probably get it to slide a little bit along there. So you can tell you're getting close, but not quite there yet. So unlock it again, and that's when you want to start making smaller incremental adjustments clockwise on this screw. And then check it. And so that's really close to where I usually have it. Easy to lock, and when it's unlocked, it's very easy to slide around. So let's see if I tighten that a hair more, if I'll like it or not. So that's a little more resistance than I usually have it at. So I'm going to back that off a little bit, counterclockwise a little bit, And that's pretty good right there. Let's see. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So now I've actually got that properly adjusted. So again, the 2 screws on the bottom fully engaged, tightened as much as possible, then do this to fine tune it to where it locks. No amount of force is going to make that move now unless it's unlocked. And then if you get success at that, then try putting the locket and then just drop your clamp down and see if this releases. Mine's not auto release, but obviously when you drop it, that should happen. So good luck.